used to tell you to. Yep, now you can go. And Kavya, introduce yourself too, because there are quite a few new people.
Sure, thanks Rajesh. Hi everyone, I'm Kavya. I'm calling from Delhi, and right now I'm kind of working with the Extinction Rebellion Global Support Group, but I have a pretty strong interest in what we can learn from our East Asian and Southeast Asian neighbors who are also facing kind of similar calamities as India in terms of the climate and ecological crisis. So on that note, I'm going to be talking a little bit about China's ecological civilization, and I'll just check that y'all can see the slides that I have up. Okay, great. So Rajesh has kind of already given a little bit of a setup for that. But before we go any further, I just want to continue with a motif that we've been talking about over the many months, which is our elephant. But I've borrowed this elephant from the Current Affairs Field Guide to Socialist Animals, since we are going to be talking about China and kind of a little bit about eco-socialism in some ways today. This is a kind of eco-socialist definition of why elephants are a really great example of maybe another way of thinking about society and structure. So some of the highlights of this are, elephants are proudly matriarchal, they share communal care, they have this matriarchal character that's gentle and herbivorous, and often, that's taken for, I think, that the fact that they're harmless, but actually this is a fun interpretation of the elephants in which they communicate through the subsonic communication, producing these deep rumbles at a frequency too low to be heard by the human ear. And so, maybe when the revolution does come, we won't hear it and it will suddenly arrive in the form of a stampede. So this is just a fun addition to our existing kind of lexicon of what the elephant might be when it comes to green up. So yeah, an alternative definition, if you will. Before diving straight into ecological civilization, I kind of want to frame a little bit where this idea comes from. Going all the way back, by no means is this a comprehensive overview of traditional Chinese philosophy, but I wanted to pick out one of the writers who was writing in the 11th century, known as Zhang Zhai, and he this is an excerpt from this document that he wrote called The Western Inscription. And really it's this invitation to think deeply about the interconnectedness of all of our actions. And it is in direct contradiction to a lot of, traditional Western philosophy, thinking about this binary that Western modernity placed us in when we said humans are separate from nature. But if you actually look at this excerpt, heaven is my father and earth is my mother, and I, a small child, find myself placed intimately between them. What fills the universe I regard as my body, what directs the universe I regard as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. So this is definitely a very different kind of philosophical tradition than we are working with and operating from, and from most of the Western countries. But clearly this is, at odds with what we hear about China in the news today. You think of the most polluted cities and places in the world, often, you don't think that this is the underlying philosophy of such a civilization. So there is this ongoing question of what causes these really serious climate and environmental problems in China. And one of the most common explanations that you will find, and it's probably true of India as well, is that China lacks this rule of law, especially environmental law. So I'm going to jump a little bit ahead kind of to modern China, and I'm going to skip over a lot of things that happened just because of the time that we have today, and talk a little bit about modern environmental law in China, because it kind of helps understand where this ecological civilization idea might be stemming from. So when we think about environmental law in China, there's actually, maybe contrary to our intuition, there's been a major increase in environmental laws that have been written in just the past decade. There's 9 laws on environmental protection, such as the water pollution prevention law, the solid waste pollution prevention and control law, and the radioactive pollution prevention and control law. There's 17 laws on resource efficiency, including renewable energy law, the cleaner production promotion law, there's a water law. And then you can add also another 50 relevant administrative laws and regulations on environmental protection, plus 600 over like 660 exactly local government regulations and 800 national standards related to environmental protection have been enacted. So this is just the past decade, right? So clearly there's no dearth of law when it comes to kind of control and regulation of the kind of environmental and climate degradation that we're seeing. However, it's really important to keep in mind this other statistic that only 1% of environmental disputes in China are actually taken to the courts. Most conflicts are settled outside of the law. And what that really demonstrates is that it's not a matter of the laws actually being kind of written in theory. It's about the fact that there's a lack of willingness to actually use them when the time arises. And so why might that be? Now, there's kind of three main arguments that people make for this. And that the first is, you know, as much as China says it's a socialist country, that there is still this worship of economic growth and development. And this takes precedence over any questions of environmental degradation within the mindset of how development goes about in the country. But to just add to that also, there is also this really anthropocentric worldview, which is in direct opposition to what we were talking about when we were looking at Zhang Jai's quote, which is and has been heightening over the different regimes, but you know, it started at Mao's and it only continued with Deng's industrial kind of regime. So in this mindset, the purpose of environmental law is not really seen in kind of this bigger, wider relationship to the ecology, but rather seen from like a public health perspective. It's seen as, oh, to protect kind of human beings' well-being rather than seeing all of the other species and the wider ecological question as a part of it. And the last and perhaps really important is to talk about resistance from interest groups. So with the opening up of China, what happened is that also the multinational corporations play a huge role in this. And they're really protected by these local governments who want to have this localized economic growth and development within their regions, and therefore don't necessarily hold them accountable to the laws that are actually put into place. So that's a little bit of a context of where the environmental law situation is coming in and how that discourse might shape things in China. Now I'm going to talk us through a little bit of a historical point of view of what ecological civilization is. But really, before we dive deep into that, I think it's important to kind of name what we mean when we talk about ecological civilization. And in the Chinese context, it's really a model of development, and it is interesting, and I think the reason that I wanted to talk about it today is it's really fascinating because it's a clear deviation from the kind of Western models of sustainable development that we've become so familiar with hearing since the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, when it was first kind of brought into public consciousness. And it's also super different from earlier models of Chinese development, which are, you know, much, much more industrial in nature. And this production development model strategy, it's hard to kind of put it into one single category, encompasses multiple different prongs. So one side of it looks at modes of production, one side of it looks at people's lifestyles and consumptions, and another side looks at conservation and restoration of entire ecological habitat. So you can see it's quite wide in its what it's encompassing. And just like a philosophical tidbit, if you're interested in kind of learning more, it is this confluence of earlier versions of like philosophical thought, a bit, you know, a spin-off of modern ecological socialism, but also this more ancient tradition of spiritual civilization. And if you even think of the two words together, the civilization word is fascinating to me because it really comes from this idea that, you know, civilization is something to aspire towards, it's flourishing, it's a higher state of human interaction and being. And so it's a really interesting kind of translation of the Mandarin, which I will shortly try to pronounce, probably very poorly, but we'll get to that in a moment. So that's giving you a brief overview of what ecological civilization is. It's kind of this paradigm of development. So before we kind of talk a little bit about how this got introduced into the Chinese constitution, we need to kind of go a little bit back further to the 17th National Party's Congress. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the Party's Congress is held every 5 years in China, and it is really the highest body within the Chinese Communist Party. And so this event is like a super symbolic event. You know, key leadership changes take place. All of the like most important policies are usually mentioned here. And it's this event that has actually gathered a lot of international attention over the years because it really gives you a sense of what China's leadership is thinking about. And so in 2007 is the first time that we see this ecological civilization concept show up. And China makes this commitment that it would undertake ecologically civilized development. And if you look in this slide here, within the red box, those are the Mandarin characters for ecological civilization. And asking some of my Mandarin speaking friends, it's Sheng Tai Wen Ming, and that's kind of, it actually doesn't have a direct translation to ecological civilization. That's kind of the best way to understand it in English, but it encompasses a much broader symbolic sense of changes in life, behavior, attitude. There's cultural transformation embedded within that, and it's also associated with these words of clarity, knowledge, brightness, this idea of almost it being a thoughtful and aware society. So you can see it's not necessarily, super scientific or technocratic. It is this very kind of spiritual or philosophical concept for how development could look like. So that was the first time that ecological civilization was ever introduced. 5 years later, at the 18th National Party's Congress, this was in 2012, ecological civilization became incorporated within the national strategy in the CCP constitution. And it was talked about as part of the 5-part national plan, which is a huge deal. These are the top 5 issues that China is facing in any given time. And the fact that ecological civilization took front and center of that should be noted with quite a lot of importance. And to just read a part of the speech that was read out at the Congress, the CCP mentioned that we're going to incorporate ecological civilization into all aspects of economic, political, cultural, and social progress. Actions and activities relating to China's geographical space, industrial structures, modes of production, and people's living should be conducive to conserving resources and protecting the environment as to create a sound working and living environment for the Chinese people and make contributions to global ecological safety. And so again, what I just want to kind of emphasize and drive home is that there's a lot that's incorporated within this vision for ecological civilization. It's at all the pillars of economic, political, cultural, social. It's looking into geographies, industrial structures, modes of production, how people should be living, how resources are being used and conserved. But I think even more interestingly, to end on that global ecological safety note, is that nod to kind of climate responsibility and at least wanting to take a role, not just for the sake of China, but for the sake of a bigger imagined community. Now, the latest kind of National Parties Congress, which is the last one, was the 19th Congress. And this is super salient because as I said, these are really symbolic events, right? So people are analyzing them from like a political commentary perspective to see how often is something mentioned, how soon is something mentioned. And what is really significant here is that ecological civilization at the 15th minute of the speech, which is really early on and in a Congress as big as this, was mentioned. And that's really key. That shows that it's clearly front and center of the CCP's imagination of what are the top priorities for their administration. And also the 2017 Party's Congress was really important because it was a change in the party's leadership. And if you know a little bit about the CCP, they regularly change the party's leadership about every decade or so to kind of show that, officials can kind of rise through the ranks, that there is some sort of sense of meritocracy, if you will, within the system. And so for the fact that the new leadership that was elected kind of put this front and center into their agenda for the next 5 years is really significant. And it corresponds with how China has been acting kind of on the global platform when it comes to their climate policy. I'm sure that someone will be presenting about this in the next couple of weeks, but it is significant that they've submitted to cut their emissions by 60 to 65% per unit of GDP by 2030. And this is kind of in line with the Paris Accord and even goes above and beyond sometimes the requirements of what most developing countries have committed to. And what I want to bring out to light here is this is kind of a screenshot of Xi Jinping talking about ecological civilization within the National Party's Congress. But within his plans, he specified in more detail steps to establish a legal and policy framework that facilitates, he mentions these exact words, green, low carbon, circular development to promote afforestation, strengthen wetland conservation and restoration, and take tough steps to stop and punish all activities that damage the environment. And he closed his theme with a real flourishing. He's saying that, you know, what we are doing today is to build an ecological civilization that will benefit generations to come. And, you know, transcending parochial boundaries, he declared that his party's abiding mission was to make new and greater contributions to mankind for both the well-being of the Chinese people and human progress. So you can really see that there's this like really big vision for what ecological civilization can look like. And as a part of that, I found it really interesting in my research that Christine Loh, who's, you know, a former politician and undersecretary within the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, she said at a Claremont McKenna college conference that China has really been showing almost leadership when it comes to climate policy and in terms of monitoring and tracking of good data collection and analysis. And I thought this was a fun tidbit to include that, you know, energy and environment are some of the key areas of study for the young workforce of China today. Like, they recognize that that's actually where the jobs lie in the future, because that's how the CCP has signaled that in their National Party's Congress. And there really is this push for this idea of, almost in the rhetoric of how they've been talking about it, you know, they can't pose themselves as this global superpower if their home isn't clean themselves. So there's a lot of rhetoric about cleaning up the house, of making a beautiful China, and ecological civilization fits within this narrative of how they want to present themselves going forward. So that's a little bit of the timeline of how ecological civilization moved around, and how it got embedded within the constitution, and how important it is to the CCP today. But I didn't want to just give you, you know, the government's perspective on things. I wanted to also problematize that a tiny bit by saying that, you know, there is a couple of folks who have something to say about this, because there is this critique that, is it ecological civilization or is it eco-authoritarianism? And there are these massive critiques, and very valid ones, I think, about the practice of top-down planning that is actually being imposed. And there's lots of examples of this, but just to name a few, is that, you know, the CCP has been stripping nomadic populations in Tibet and Inner Mongolia of their herds, of their, you know, natural pastures. These are the indigenous communities who are kind of being removed from their lands and relocated, often within, you know, rural or denser urban areas. There are massive amounts of hydroelectric dam projects that have taken place over the past couple of years, often at the expense of locals and environmentalists who've been very vocally against these projects taking place. And I'm sure all of us have heard about the Belt and Road Initiative, and there's a lot of very, very ambiguous green credentials involved in how that is, you know, it's not necessarily clear if that is in line with what they're saying in theory about ecological civilization. And this is kind of a book that talks about that in much more detail. But at the end of the day, we can't forget that China's political economic system is still based on this need to maximize growth. There still is this focus on economic growth and development. And without those things being separated, it's not clear how this model of ecological civilization will be practiced from theory. And the last kind of important thing is that often there's this other critique that these green policies are often masquerading, you know, these social, actually forms of social control. And so in 2019, there were these big recycling laws that came into force in Shanghai in July of 2019. And, you know, the regulations address this real problem, and at the same time, they're really fiddly and they're really onerous. And what that happened is it bred a lot of distrust within the communities. And, you know, in investigating, journalists have said that the rubbish inspectors in the city had said that they were going to start rummaging inside residents' refuse sacks and punishing those who dumped garbage outside of approved hours. And that a lot of inspectors were boasting that the bins will soon have facial recognition cameras to catch violators and to bring an orderly future a step closer. So there's really these much more like sinister tone of social control that is also coming side by side with ecological civilization, which makes a lot of people say that this is really just a new form of eco-authoritarianism. So just to maybe wrap things up, and this is kind of my final slide, is I think it's important to kind of bring this conversation back to India, because we are green up at the end of the day. And I think there's a lot of really interesting implications and questions that I just want to throw out within our meeting to talk about a little bit, is that could there really be this Indian parallel for an ecological civilization? And if so, what might that look like? Would it need us to embed such a consciousness in our constitution? Because we also have, you know, socialist within our constitution. Would it help to have another word in front of them, which is something that Rajesh had talked about a while ago? Is that even necessary? Is that the way that we will kind of embed this consciousness? Because clearly, you know, the CCP has this very clear top-down perspective on these things, which might be slightly different from what might work in India. I think, but beyond that, what could an alternative bottoms up ecological civilization look like in India, which might be much more interesting to talk about. And for that kind of extent, I just wanted to include this slide, this graphic about eco-Swaraj, which Ashish Kothari talks about a lot as another alternative vision for what ecological civilization might mean within India. And it's a much more dense topic that maybe we can talk about another time. But I think the question of justice has still remained quite unclear in China's ecological civilization. It's clear that the top-down messaging is one thing and then the ground reality is another. So these are all things to be mindful of as we think about how relevant such a philosophical or development model might be for India. And that's pretty much what I have to share for today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Kavya, for a lovely presentation. I personally learned a lot from it. So first of all, some claps are in order. Yeah, exactly. And questions?
I think you did go into this briefly, but I was just wondering about what these policies look like on the ground. Like, what sort of local change have they resulted in? Is there any sort of, have there been any studies that are looking at the impact of these policies? Or
yeah, it's a great question, Apajita. I don't know if I'm necessarily qualified to answer it, but I'll try my best. I'm definitely by no means an expert on China. My sense from what I did read was that, all of it is very top down still, and data is still, heavily controlled. We do get the data that the CCP is happy to give us, as opposed to necessarily the data. It sounds like maybe a familiar story to some of us here, actually. But it's not always clear, and the policies are still very top down. There is a little bit of leeway. Often urban centers have more power over how they can allow certain policies to be enacted or not, but it's not uniform at all, and I don't think there's necessarily a clear overview. Often these things are studied very well on an air pollution level or water pollution level, but on like a bigger climate emissions kind of study, I didn't necessarily come across a lot of it. So I think it's still an ongoing area of study, even though they're claiming that there is a lot more push towards more data and transparency. But I think we'll have to see if that's true. But just given the state of all of the other big countries and big superpowers in the world at the moment, China unfortunately comes across as, the best of the lot, and so that's a bit sad to keep in mind, I guess.
So I have a question. It's not really maybe it's a question for further research rather than to be answered right now. Given that China's biggest developmental push across the world has been the OBOR initiative, right? One Belt, One Road. I'm wondering if this ecological civilization has influenced the specific projects that have come in OBOR, and if not, that would be a concrete sign that it has real teeth and not just a window dressing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it would be a really interesting presentation, and I hope someone else would be willing to take that on, because I did see mixed reviews. You have to be, I think, for me, the biggest learning also while making this presentation is, depending on the source, you get wildly different narratives for exactly the same thing that's happening in China.
Okay.
I have two related questions as well. Also, probably further research, but thank you so much. Like, this was really interesting to learn about. And, when I first heard ecological civilization in China, I was really confused. So the question is, when you talk about the activists on the ground who have been campaigning around environmental issues, how much does do the limitations on democracy in China affect that? And what are the kind of, has anyone been killed? The other one is, when you think about some of the laws, you had mentioned the 1% of laws that are actually implemented. What are the kind of cases that are taken up in court? Have you seen anything around that? And yeah, those two for now.
Cool, I'll try my best. Yeah, the first question is, I think, the real question that everyone is asking, was coming from the ecological civilization, from any amount of criticality, because it's well known that, activism is not exactly welcomed in China. And it's, activists have had a really, really hard time. I think most of the times they've lost, right? Because they really have no power to kind of, even if they can organize or mobilize on the local level, because of also the way that China's social media is separate from the world's social media. Often this information is all kind of stays within the mainland. We don't really get to find out what is happening on these local levels. So I don't actually have any statistics on hand, but my suspicion would be that, yeah, a lot of people have been harmed in trying to protect their kind of local areas. And I was talking about the hydroelectric dams. Those are some of the most obvious examples that exist out there. For your second question, I haven't looked into which exactly were the 1% of the cases, but I would imagine that they're largely about, I think they're about mostly like corporate, but they're very amicable settlements. It's these 1% of cases. If you can see, like, imagine what is happening on the 99% of the things. The 1% is really like the nicest of cases that can be happily resolved one way or another within the virtues of the law. So I'll take a look at it a little bit further and maybe write back to everyone and see what exactly the law is. But part of my limitation is I don't speak Mandarin, so a lot of the resources that I have accessible that would be from the ground, I have to kind of ask friends to translate, but maybe I'll be able to get back to you with some more concrete details.
Oh, you're soon going to be in Singapore, where I think there'll be plenty of Mandarin speakers around you. So, Preeta, you have raised your hand, so I'm gonna.
Yeah, no, thanks for the presentation. It's really nice to get a deeper insight than what we read in general media. And what I found exciting, or whatever interesting and slightly alarming, is that even for a country like China, it's taken them, I don't know, more than 5 years for them to articulate a political intent and then put it to action. So I don't know what is the pace at, like, I wanted to know what this means for countries like India, where things take longer and things are messier and more complex. So, and also, I mean, in the general global discourse, it's always been that, like China and India are not pulling their weight, and now China seems ready to pull its weight. So what does this mean for India?
Yeah, those are all really, really great questions. I think I'm asking myself much of the same as I was researching. I think for me, what is distinct though is, this is my hope, at least. This has been how I've envisioned India, is to have a much more democratic and grassroots envisioning of how, decision making should look like, which is vastly different from how things have been happening in China for many years now. So I think what could be really interesting is asking the question, do we even need to take the path that China has taken? Will ecological civilization, or some version of the idea and theory, actually come from the constitution? Will it come from the top down? Or is it something that needs to be radically imagined in totally different ways in India? And how effective would that be is another conversation that we could totally have. But yeah, you're right. We're running out of time. So it's not clear if we have the time for that to happen.
There's only one correct answer to that question, Kavya, which is green up is India's future. You should understand the propaganda that we are trying to push here.
I'm slowly learning. That's absolutely the right answer. Thanks.
There you go.
That
There
question was totally not planted.
Munna.
Yes, तो मेरा एक्चुअली क्वेश्चन ये है कि मतलब क्वेश्चन से ज़्यादा मैं थोड़ा समझना चाह रहा हूँ कि जो चाइनीज़ मॉडल है इकोलॉजिकल सिविलाइजेशन का, इस पर आप बात कर रही थी, अमूमन इंडिया में भी जो डेवलपमेंट का मॉडल है वो उसी के एरा में जा रहा है. मतलब हम लोग भी बहुत सारे हाइड्रो पावर्स या बहुत सारे प्रोजेक्ट्स, मतलब इंडिया भी चाइना बनना चाहता है. और मतलब मुझे एक सेंस होता है कि हमारा जो इकोलॉजिकल सिविलाइजेशन है वो मेजर ट्राइबल आबादी में है और उनका एक सेंस था इकोलॉजी को संभालने का और ये करने का. चाइना ने मेजर जो उनके ट्राइबल्स है उनके साथ जो कर रही है उनके एरियाज में वो दिखता है, रिफ्लेक्ट करता है. तो मैं ये जानना चाह रहा था कि क्या हम लोग भारत में जो चाइना के मॉडल पे जाना चाह रहे हैं, तो मतलब ये लॉन्ग टर्म पर्सपेक्टिव नहीं, लेकिन चाइना की कोई एक अच्छी चीज हो एनवायरमेंटल सिविलाइजेशन में जिसको भारत को अपनाना चाहिए, क्योंकि भारत चाइना को फॉलो कर रहा है, सब सारे डिजास्टर पॉइंट्स आ रहे हैं, लेकिन कोई चाइना का कोई इकोलॉजिकल सिविलाइजेशन पे कोई ऐसा महत्वपूर्ण पॉइंट है जिसको भारत के एक्टिविस्ट या भारत की जो नीति जो जो एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव या जो इस तरीके से सोचते हैं उनको अपनाना चाहिए? मतलब डिजास्टर तो हम लोग अपना ही रहे हैं, लेकिन कोई एक अच्छी चीज जो हो, तो वो मैं जानना चाह रहा था।
ये आपका बहुत अच्छा सवाल है। मेरे हिसाब से एक्चुअली जो मैं पहले बात कर रही थी, जो उनका डेटा कलेक्शन का जो मॉडल है, आई नो कि थोड़ा सा शेकी है. I kind of have to research that a little bit more, but I thought it was really interesting that they are really interested in upskilling the youth. Like most of their university programs are about data collection, monitoring. They're, you know, training people to, you know, it's coming still from this position of fear. Ki, matlab, you don't want to, the whole mechanism is working through this kind of serious system of oppression. And at the same time, China is one of the few countries that reports, you know, daily air quality samples collected from all around the nation on an online website, you know, and those figures are actually trusted. And when researchers have from independent institutions and universities looked at satellite imagery, have said that, oh, it actually maps what they're reporting would map our third party kind of verification of that same data. So, I mean, I know that there's probably a lot of challenges. You know, data is not a apolitical subject, but at the same time, I do think that it's quite interesting that they're investing so much money and resources into upskilling and training this whole section of the youth in knowing that these are the jobs of the future. I mean, I think हमारे देश में अभी तक वो discourse फैला ही नहीं है कि this is actually what the jobs of the future need to be. So I think that that's actually something that could be really interesting and should be, you know, a part of maybe what GreenUp looks into. What are the green jobs of the future in India? I think would be a really interesting question.
So that's as good a time for me to launch into more propaganda. First of all, thank you, Kavya, for the lovely presentation. If there are more questions, you know, we can use the chat window to put them in. Alok has, you know, put some things in the chat window too. So what I wanted to say is, especially after what Munna said about Adivasi and tribal communities being at the forefront of to the extent that India has an ecological civilization, right? But we know the intense impact on those areas as a result of development. So GreenUp is very actively looking at it. One of our, in fact, our first major GreenUp project, so to speak, is going to be what's called GreenUp the Northeast, where we are engaging in strong consultations, eventually leading to a wicked sprint, hopefully sometime early to mid next year. And we just had a conversation with Gaurav Gogoi, who is, as you know, the deputy leader of the opposition in the Lok Sabha. And hopefully we therefore will be ready to sort of take a serious look at what our version of an ecological civilization might even start looking like, right? And that will include things like livelihoods, jobs, the kind of training that we need. How do you bring together traditional knowledge systems with more sort of contemporary ideas of how climate change works, how data is collected, all of those things. So watch this space is what I would like to say.
And just to add, we have a lot of work to do for Green Up the Northeast. So, you know, I mean, if any of you are interested, please, I mean, we could use support and help, and you know.
And we do have people from the Northeast and people who have worked in the Northeast in the call. Maybe Chaya, you can say a word or two.
Yes, so I've been trying to create this network of individuals and institutions who've already been working with local livelihoods, traditional knowledge systems. Most of these people do not have a lot of expertise on the science and technological sector. So we were thinking of integrating our traditional knowledge systems, local artists, local, you know, elders with Team Green Up, which has a lot of technical expertise. And maybe we could collaborate on work on projects like biomimicry. You know, we have a lot of biomimicry in a traditional cultures. And why I'm talking about these things is because I feel like these are things that would instantly attract people. Tarini, like I think one of the talks she talked about things going viral. We live in a world where things go viral, and academic papers not so much. So we need to, we were thinking of coming up with certain things that could catch the attention of all stakeholders, all people, all participants, and then use that to engage on conversations of legislative policy advocacy and changes and so on. We have a team now, but it'd be really great if more people would want to join in, even visit the Northeast. We're also trying to create workshops or visits and work together. So we're working on that. So hopefully by next year, we'll come up with solid plans, initiatives, and interventions.
Thank you. So with that thought, on a note of optimism, I want to thank Kavya once again for a lovely presentation. Maybe if there's a short write-up that can come with it, then we can propagate that into our networks. And next week, Aprajita, you're on, right? You know this. Okay, good. You're going to talk about India's national climate policies. So the NAPCC and the SAPCCs. If you're saying something, you're muted.
So I couldn't unmute myself. Yeah, so I will be focusing on the NAPCCs and go into detail about some of the more significant SAPCCs or more effective.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so next week, same time. And so the usual protocol is if you are muted and or not on video, just come for a second, say bye, and then we quit. Bye then.